Welcome to the 100th episode of the Good Food CFO podcast. I am your host, Sarah Delavan, and as always, I am joined by our producer, Chelsea Steer.
Hey, Sarah. Yes, 100th episode. I'm so excited. It honestly feels like just yesterday that I joined this team. And I think back then we were maybe a little before halfway to 100. So just to be here today and be celebrating this 100th episode, it feels a little unreal and really, really cool.
It feels wild for me as well because there was a point in time where someone had suggested that I do a podcast, and I was like, no, no one wants to hear a podcast about food, business, financials. And then it started to grow in my mind, and I thought, oh, wait, this does make sense. And I think the evolution of this podcast is, I mean, it's something I'm really proud of and I'm excited to keep on doing. So, yeah, it's an exciting day, and I'm so glad to have you here to
Yeah.
celebrate it with me.
And I can confirm that, yes, there are people who do want to listen. And I'd love to actually put a point on that by reading a review to kick things off today.
I love that.
Yeah, so today's review comes from MOGF, is
Okay.
their name on Apple. And they said, amazing info. As a longtime manufacturer looking for a co-packer and a serial podcast listener, this is all the info I needed 24 years ago when I started my company. I was charged lots of money. I'm qualifying that. They use $4 signs, lots of money to know what this podcast just told you slash us.
That's so great to hear. It's nice to know that the work that you do is helpful to people, right? And that validation is lovely, but not only do I love to hear reviews, but they also truly do help the podcast. It's in fact one of the best ways that you all as listeners can support us, because the more reviews we have, the more, positive ratings we have, the easier it is for new listeners to find the show. And another great way, actually, to support the podcast is also to become a member. And Chelsea, we just made some really fun updates to our membership that I think we should share with our audience. What do you think?
Yeah, definitely. If you are a listener, you've been a listener, you've probably heard us talk about membership and community before, and we've always referred to it as our Plus membership. But we actually changed the name. That's one of the first updates, and it is now called our Babo Yacht membership.
Yeah, I just want to say that, like, we knew that the Plus membership was a boring name, right? But, like,
Yeah.
I think we struggled to find something that was the right fit. And as we were, if you do listen to the podcast and if you are part of our mailing list and things, we did our annual survey recently. That's something that we do once a year at the Good Food CFO to make sure that we are creating content and providing services and resources that are really helpful to our audience. And as we were working through that process and talking about, okay, what kind of updates do we want to make, we realized that we had this name for the membership just sort of sitting in our back pocket for like 2 years.
Yeah.
And I like to tell this story here because, Babo Yacht stands for building a business on your own terms. And we've renamed our membership the Babo Yacht membership partially or really because that is who this podcast is for. That is who the Good Food CFO as a business and a brand is for. It's founders who are striving to build businesses on their own terms and who are discovering what does that mean for them and how do they want to build their businesses. That term came to be, was it 2 years ago, Chelsea? We were at a retreat, business retreat in
Yeah.
Joshua Tree. We were talking about really like the birth of the Good Food CFO beyond this podcast. And we said the term building a business on your own terms so many times that it got shortened to the acronym Babo Yacht.
Yeah.
And then we used it as a password. We don't do that anymore, obviously. We would, files were named that. It was just used everywhere internally
Yeah.
on our
Hashtag.
team. Yeah. And so as we were sitting, as I said, and brainstorming, some of the other, upgrades that have been happening around the Good Food CFO as a result of the survey, it was like, why aren't we calling the membership the Baba Yacht membership? It just seems so right for it. So I'm really excited about that name change.
Absolutely. And I also think, you know, as you so relevantly pointed out, that this membership and what we're doing really is for the Baba Yachts of the
Hmm.
world, right? The
Yeah.
people that are building a business on their own terms. And it's almost like we want to, for lack of a better word, create an army of Baba Yachts, right?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
change the food industry,
Yeah.
right? The Good Food CFO, and by extension, this podcast and what we're talking about on this podcast is on a mission to build financial confidence, redefine equitability in our food system, and revolutionize our food industry.
Yeah.
And becoming a Babo Yacht member is a direct investment in helping us to achieve that goal and our mission,
Yeah.
and really to join the army, right? To
Yeah.
be part of the revolution. And by the way, in doing so, you're going to get some pretty cool benefits along the way.
Yeah. I mean, I also want to share with people, and we've recently added this information to our website. We have really big goals for the Good Food CFO. Our long term vision is not to have this podcast in the way that it exists today. We have a grander vision for it. We have a grander vision for the Good Food CFO and how it supports founders. And we've made the sometimes challenging decisions to not have advertisements on the podcast. We've examined it multiple times and it has just never passed the gut check, sort of
Yeah.
the standards and mission check and values check. And so we don't have ads on the podcast. We don't promote our show and our brand on social media, like Facebook and things like that. That's another decision that we have made for a variety of different reasons that align with our values. But that also makes it difficult for us to grow the show and to grow the audience. So just kind of going back to like the reviews help. It's a 100% free way to say thank you for the content we're creating. So if you like it, it's a great energy exchange. And if you have the funds available and you feel so inclined to become a member and invest in what we are trying to build here, like that would make us forever grateful and will just help us to meet our big, big goals even faster. And so I do want to touch on the benefits of membership really quickly, just to kind of round this conversation out. One of them is updates on the revolution and how we're moving the revolution forward, and also how this podcast and the brand are going to be evolving, right? As members, you deserve to know like how we're putting funds to use and what we're doing to improve. And that's another reason that we do our survey every year, right? This is
Yeah.
like, it's in a way, this is very much like founder led, founder driven, and that's really exciting to say.
Yeah, we also are still offering access to our exclusive archive of bonus content
Yep.
from the podcast. I love that benefit. And then also one that I'm really excited about that we're going to kind of dive into this season is, celebrating if you've made the decision to support us. And like you talked about before, right? It's an energy exchange. We
Yeah.
want to support you right back. So we're going to be highlighting some brands, at the top of episodes, and giving some shout outs and letting people know like who is a Bobby Yacht, who is, as I said before, part of this army, who's going to bat, with us.
Yeah. We're also, as a result of the survey, we just want to keep shouting out that survey because it really, we listen, we respond, and we do make upgrades and updates according to it. And one of the things that our members and listeners really asked for was networking events, Q&A sessions with me, and also coaching sessions, which was
Hmm.
really like great and interesting feedback. So we have incorporated all three of those types of live events for members. We call them kind of like quarterly events, basically. All of those details are on the membership website. And I'm super excited about that. And there are two ways to support. So you can be a monthly Baba Yacht member, or you can be an annual Baba Yacht member. And if you do join or, support us on that annual level, you'll also get 10% off site wide on all of the coaching courses and resources that we have to offer. So that's everything from our CFO office hours to our financial forecasting tools to our cash flow tools, you name it. If it's available on the website and you're an annual member, you get 10% off. So,
Yeah. And then one last thing I do want to shout out that I think is really cool that we're doing is we've also created a place for all members at any time, day or night, to hop into the membership page and submit questions directly
Yeah,
to you, the Good Food CFO, and really also be a great opportunity to, get back to those Ask the Good Food CFO episodes of the podcast.
I'm real excited about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of Ask the Good Food CFO episodes, I'm going to segue here because our 100th episode, what we're going to be diving into today, is a direct result of a question asked in the Good Food CFO community.
Hmm.
And it was some questions that came up around this idea of a 50% margin not being quote good, right? We have talked about it a number of times on the podcast, going back to the rethinking cash flow episode, to some of the more recent episodes. And I want to say thank you to Danielle, who is the community member who brought her questions to me, right? And who said, "Hey, I've been talking about this with folks on my team and they're really pushing back." And she, I spoke to her this week and I was thankful to her for coming to us and saying, "Hey, I'm trying to describe this to my team. I'm trying to explain this to my team and I'm getting some pushback, frankly. And I don't know how to answer the question any better. I don't know how to help inform them." And when I spoke to her this week, she said, "I'm really sorry. I don't mean to be challenging you." And I said, "No, by no means. When you ask a question, when as a founder you are saying, 'Hey, can you dig deeper into this? Can you go further and explain it to me?' It does a couple of things that are of immense value to not only me and to that founder, but to this entire community of founders who are listening. Number one, it helps me to know that people are ready to dig deeper into a
Yeah.
topic that maybe we've just brushed the surface on here on the podcast. It also helps me to kind of learn from the questions and modify how I answer or how I explain a concept. And what we're doing today in this episode is looking at how product margins impact a business's reliance on debt. And as a result of Danielle's questions and really thinking through and trying to provide a good answer for her, we created a couple of models. So by model, I mean spreadsheets, right? That can help us to model out how a change in product margin will change the finances of a business.
Yeah, the ripple effect, right?
Yeah. There's three different models. One is super, super simple. So if you're new to this and you're not a super numbers person, we're going to start easy. And then we're going to move to a slightly more kind of in-depth or complex model. And then we're going to go to sort of the final model where you'll really get to see the impacts of product margin on a business. So we highly recommend that you tune into this episode on YouTube. Chelsea, maybe you can let people know where they can find us on YouTube.
Yeah, I will start out by saying you're definitely still going to get value by just listening to this episode. If you're in the car or something and you're thinking, oh no, you're going to get the value out of it. But yes, for those who like a visual aid or a little like a visual learner, you are going to get some extra value by watching this one on YouTube, by watching the video, which you can find our channel on YouTube at the Good Food CFO, all one word.
Yeah. I guess I get a little excited because it's spreadsheets. And I think that the visual is just so impactful. But you're right. We've tested this episode out on a couple of people, some who looked at the YouTube video and others who just listened. And it's really good to know that you can get value both ways.
Well, Sarah, I don't want to take up any more time. I'm ready to jump right into this deep dive.
I agree. Let's do it.
Do you want more from the Good Food CFO? Join our newsletter. When you sign up for the Good Food CFO newsletter, you'll get updates from us about the podcast, what's happening in the Good Food CFO community, articles from the Good Food CFO herself, Sarah Delavan, and information about the free and low-cost resources that will support you in building a business on your own terms, all delivered straight to your inbox weekly. Just visit thegoodfoodcfo.com to sign up today. And now, back to the show. So, Sarah, as I mentioned before in the opening segment of the episode, we recently had a flurry of conversation online and in our community about margin scaling, cash flow. And it was a hot debate, I'll say, of people really trying to understand what it is that you mean when you say 50% margin is not good for your food business.
Yeah. I think part of it might be that I'm picking on a very specific percentage. I'm picking on 50%. And I do that on purpose because it's a widely accepted target that businesses should be shooting for. And we have seen that not work for people. Actually, like time and time again, even at margins slightly better than 50%, we see models where it's not working. And truth be told, in the time that we live in where there is so much media and social activity and content and advice that is being given, in order for what I'm saying to hit people and to stop and make them think, I had to choose a number to pick on, and 50% is primed for the picking. I mean, we've
Yeah.
had guests on the podcast before that said, you should be shooting for 50% margin, and sort of had to kind of walk back from that in the episode and go, but really, is it? You know what I mean? And one of the central pillars of our work and this podcast is that we want people to build businesses on their own terms. And that means creating a financial situation in their business that they are comfortable with,
Yeah.
right? In addition to building the kind of business you want, there's this element of building a business that you are financially comfortable with. And if we go back to the original conversation we had on the podcast about margin, and that was the rethinking cash flow episode, it came from an email that I was sent where a founder was saying, I thought I understood how this worked. I invested money into the marketing and the building of the foundations of the business. I invested money into creating the first round of product, and I thought that from the sale of those products, I would have money to reinvest in production and to even possibly grow my business. And I don't. And they were asking, how do other businesses do this? And I shared this in that episode, but I sat on that email for a couple of months
Yeah.
because it's such a big question. It's such a heavy question. And a lot of the founders that reach out to us, particularly on the Sarah Delavan consulting side, they have found themselves in a very difficult financial situation because they're trying to achieve targets that aren't right for their business, but they heard that they were right, in the media or in a business book, or, via another founder who is succeeding, at those targets. And it feels like my responsibility, and I take it very seriously, to break through the noise and help people. And so back to the original question of like, why do we pick on 50% margin? Because we need people to understand that this is not a one size fits all margin target. And indeed, you can succeed financially in your business with different margins. And we want you to understand what that looks like and what it means so that founders can make decisions on their own for what is best for them.
And we've had many conversations here on the podcast where you have talked about how, if you're wanting to build a business on your own terms, right? How to determine what those targets are for your business.
Mm-hmm.
But I am really interested in diving into why this is kind of that starting point, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talking about profit margin and how you decided that this was your like line in the sand and 50% is the number that you're going to pick on, like you said.
Yeah. Yeah. So it goes to the work that we do with clients one-on-one, and the financials that we see when we're working with our coaching clients, right? In the office hours and things of that nature. We see the margins that businesses are operating with. And when we talk about margin, just to make sure we're all on the same page, we're talking about gross profit margin, right? So we see that number, and what we tend to see is the closer to 50 it is, the more struggle there is with cash flow. The closer it gets to zero, the more intense that cash flow struggle gets. The closer it gets to 100%, which is an unrealistic amount, but just for, as an example, the easier cash flow gets. And within that, sort of added to that, is that when cash flow isn't flowing very well, right, there is a reliance on debt of some kind to fund the business. And at the core, if you don't understand A, what your margin is, and B, how that margin is affecting your cash flow, what we've seen is that people have a lot of emotions around the amount of debt that they need to take on to keep their business going. So I think what we're trying to do is to say, hey, let's try to help people have an understanding rooted in sort of the starting point of 50% gross profit margin, so that if they see that their business is requiring debt and more debt and more debt, and they also can recognize what their margin is, they can then go, oh, I understand some changes that I need to make or that I can make to move my profit margin in the right direction and release some of the reliance on debt that I have. Additionally, if you're someone who's comfortable with taking on debt, right, then you can sort of push it a little bit in terms of margin. You might say, you know what, I'm comfortable taking on debt, and therefore I'm going to work with a 45% margin, and I understand what that means for my business, and I'm good with it, right? So it's knowledge, it's information, it's putting founders in control of their finances and the decisions that they're making around their finances.
Yeah, I love that. I think you make a really good point there that it is about you and your business,
Mhm.
right? And what you're comfortable with. And I think all of that is what we would call here at the Good Food CFO your terms, right?
Exactly. Yep.
So before we really dive into this concept of gross profit margin and how that has an effect on your business, on the cash flow, and the amount of debt that you have to take on in order to either sustain or grow your business. I have a couple questions here because I know there's a couple disclaimers to this, and you've already
Sure.
gotten into a few of them, right? To this idea of 50% margin isn't good, but I have a couple questions. So, number one is, as we had this conversation in the community, I know that you have really framed this conversation in the past in what you have yourself called an oversimplified way.
Mhm.
Why do you do that?
Number one, because I have found that if I go too far into financial concepts, it's easy to lose a portion of the audience or a portion of the listeners. And so oversimplifying it and making sort of a simple math equation, right, is meant to get people thinking. And some people think about it and they're able to run through the financial scenarios the rest of the way and it makes sense to them. And other people will think about that oversimplified way and go, wait, I don't understand how this plays out the way that you're describing it. So help me play it out. And when someone's ready to go those next steps, then I'm ready to go with them. But I guess in a sense, right? Like my goal is to get people to hear this and to get people to think about their numbers. And it's been 7 years of communicating to people. And I've found that let's start real simple and we can build from there.
So, I think we're going to build a little bit on that idea today.
Yeah.
Another thing I want to clarify or really get some clarity from you around is when you are talking about this concept or this idea of margin and 50% not being a good margin, right, for
Hmm.
your food business, the examples that you're giving, right,
Hmm.
are starting with the beginning of a business.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of that is because when we work through the scenarios and when we talk about it, there's not a single business that starts magically with free money, right?
Exactly. Yeah. A lot of the sort of feedback or like questions we get surrounding this concept is that, well, at a 50% margin, you're sort of making back the money that you spent and that money will add up in your checking account, let's say. And that is true, but not from day one. It is true at some future point in your business. And one of the things we talk about in a lot of our like education is needing to know when your business will become profitable and how much money it will take to get there. Because when you start a business, as you just said, like a business doesn't inherently start with money, right? When you open a business checking account, someone has to put money into that to fund what the business is going to do. It's going to be the founder with a credit card or an SBA loan or a different type of bank loan or family funding, right? Some way, somehow, outside money is going into the business. And if we start at that point with a 50% margin, two things. One, we have to pay back that debt, right? And two, we need to understand at what point at that 50% margin while we're paying down debt will we officially flip into having a cash abundant business. Going back to that rethinking cash flow episode, right? That founder was maybe, I might get this wrong, but they were a couple of years into their business and they had no idea if profitability would come, if cash flow positive, would ever get reached. And so the reason that we start with this oversimplified idea and that we take it from the beginning of a business is to stress this point of at 50% in particular, you will not have positive cash flow, right? You won't have a long cash runway in your business right away. You will at some point in the future. And part of our work is to figure out at what point is that. And we're going to dive into that and sort of illustrate that for people later in this show. But we're trying to illustrate the reliance on debt, how your margin affects that, and that from the beginning of a business, you start in debt and we want to pay those debts back.
What I hear you saying is, from the start of a business, right, at that 50% margin, yes, there will be cash in your business at some point, but it's going to take time to get
Yeah.
there. And I think that again, that goes back to what is the business that you are wanting to build, right? If
Mm-hmm.
you have these grand plans in your head that you're going to, grow exponentially in your first year and you're going to like those things aren't really a reality.
Not at 50%.
Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
exactly. Well, as you said, we're going to play out some scenarios here and maybe unsimplify this idea a little bit. So you're going to share your screen with us. And so I,
Mm-hmm.
I would shout out to our listeners. This is one of those episodes that I highly suggest watching on YouTube, especially if you're a visual learner
Yeah.
and you really want to see how these numbers are playing out. Definitely check us out on YouTube at the Good Food CFO.
Yeah, I will do my best to sort of say the numbers that we're looking at and describe what's happening on the screen. I know Chelsea, you'll support me in this, but
Yeah.
absolutely, like it will be easier to follow on YouTube. So we're starting out with what I'm calling once again a simple margin and cash flow examples. All right, so at the top of the sheet here we have our margin. And so we're going to start the example at 50%. So we're making the assumption here, as we discussed, that this business is being started with a credit card. And so in this really simple example, the founder used the credit card and spent $600 to have product made. And at a 50% margin, that $600 in spend is going to result in $1,200 of revenue. Now, if we were to pay back the cost, right, that $600, then we have $600 in cash remaining in the business. If we want to produce more product, right, and generate more revenue, then we need to purchase more products. And so that's going to cost us another $600, right? So $1,200 in revenue, we made a $600 payment to the credit card. We got $600 cash on hand, and we're going to use that to purchase more product. That essentially leaves $0 for operating expenses. And this is sort of like point number one, right? Oversimplified again, but what this is to illustrate is that when we spend money to make a product, and we're selling it at a 50% margin, there's just enough money to make another round of product, that same number of units.
And so I just want to jump in and kind of get some clarity here too. When you're talking about operating expenses, I know that we have talked about this in past episodes, but really what you're referencing there is like either rent or payment for a facility in which to make your product, labor for anyone who is not directly related to the production of the product.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if you're selling at a farmer's market, right? Like what is the cost of doing business at that farmer's market? How do you even do any of that in this scenario?
Well, I think the big takeaway here is like you'd have to have money, additional money in the business, right, to fund operating costs. Because, again, going back to in the beginning of the business, if you're selling at a 50% margin, that first round of product sales, right, you've done that first round of production, you sell through that entire production run, you have not generated enough money to do anything other than create another round of product,
Yeah.
period. So you have to have additional money in the business bank account to fund operations, because it's going to take time before your sales can help to fund operations at 50% margin.
Gotcha.
So as we continue down the sheet, right? So from this repurchase, so we've decided to spend the $600 that we do have left from that $1,200 that we generated. We decided to spend it on more product. We're still selling at a 50% margin, so we've generated that $1,200 again. And now we're going to repurchase COGS for another round of production, and that's going to be $600. And in this iteration, right, this sort of like round two, we do have $600 available, right, additionally in the business. Now, that money could be used to put toward operating expenses. But if we go back to that email that I got from the founder, right, that sparked that rethinking cash flow episode, they want to grow their sales. They want to produce more products so they can generate more revenue. That growth is funded from this $600. So it's an either or kind of scenario. We can either put this money toward our operating expenses, right? And then just produce that same number of units and kind of continue that cycle, at least for now.
Mhm.
Or we can take some or all of this money and put it toward growing our production, right? And growing our income. Again, this scenario is telling us that we need additional money in the business to at least fund it, still at this point. And if we want to grow the production, there'll be funding that would be needed for that as well. So very simplified example meant to illustrate how little money there is to go around the first few rounds, if not for several rounds of sales, right, from your production.
I'm very curious in this, super simplified example, what does that look like if we're running a margin under 50%?
Yeah. And this is where things get very exciting. So if you haven't tuned into YouTube yet, now is the time. So 50%, again, is sort of that middle of the road. And it's sort of like we could be in a flow. We know we need to rely on a certain amount of debt to kind of get things going. And we understand that, right? If we change this margin to 40%, what we're showing
Mm.
on the spreadsheet now is that for every $600 in production that we do, we're now generating $1,000 in revenue rather than that 1,200. And so now when we pay that $600 back onto the credit card, we have $400 in cash on hand available to produce another round of product. And so what that means when we're producing just $400 worth of product at now that 40% margin, our revenue on that is just
Mm.
660, well, round up $667. And we can see here that, like, okay, now if we try to repurchase, we've got a bit more money, we're going to try to repurchase that $600 worth again, right? We have $67 in the bank account. Just the amount of money flowing through the business is so much smaller at 40%. And what that means is that even more money from outside of the operations of the business, from outside of the sale of our product, are going to be needed to fund operations and to fund future growth.
Yeah.
Whereas if we change this to 60%, so I'm going to go back to 50, right? And sort of reset my numbers here.
Yeah. I'm excited to look at 60%. I am someone personally who is very averse to taking on debt. And
Okay.
so that 40% did stress me out a little bit looking at those numbers. So I'd like to give me something that's going to make me feel a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So we've reset the numbers here back to 50%. And so now we're going to change the margin to 60. And what you're going to see is that there's money available for operating expenses, right? Right from the get go. Right. So in this
Hmm.
scenario, 60% margin on that $600 worth of production is now $1,500 in revenue. So when we pay that $600 back on the credit card, we have $900 available in the business. 600 is going to go to making that second round of production, and there's $300 remaining. That is money, again, that you could use toward your operating expenses, or you could use to put toward the growth of your production. Every business is going to require debt at the onset to fund the initial operations. But the how much you need and how soon you'll be able to grow is totally dependent at this point on what your margins are, right? And
Yeah.
and this shows that.
I love this. I love these examples. I love that it's like very clearly laid out what these profit margins, the impact that they can have, right, on your business from the very beginning.
Yeah.
But, in this example, we're starting with that $600 in debt, but we're putting that entire $600 towards production, right?
Mhm.
Typically, when a business is starting out and they're taking on debt or they're using their credit card or whatever, in this scenario, we're using that full $600 that we borrowed on production,
Mhm.
right? But there's going to be other things that a business has to use that money for in
Uh-huh.
the beginning, like to set up their business. And then the other piece that I'm seeing is that, within that first kind of production cycle or sales cycle, we're paying back that debt in full right away, that full $600.
Yeah.
And I think typically for a business, right, they're not going to be paying that debt back in full right away.
Yeah.
So I would love it if you could kind of play out for us or show us maybe a scenario that it is a little closer to that situation.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. So here we've got a new spreadsheet up on the screen, and I'm going to talk through for those who aren't looking at it, sort of what we have going on here. So again, this is a scenario where we need to pick numbers. We tried to pick numbers that are in a reasonable relation to one another. But here's the thing, it doesn't matter what numbers we picked. So I don't want anyone listening or watching to go, oh, but this is a scenario with $10,000 borrowed, right? And I borrowed more than that, or I borrowed less than that. It's not about the dollar amounts. It's about what we see when we change the margin and how it affects cash flow and reliance on debt, right? So pay attention to those things here. But with that, in this scenario, we borrowed $10,000 total. We utilized half of it to set up the business. So again, going back to that original email that I got however many seasons ago, where they took a portion of their money and spent it on setting up the business, the marketing, the branding, right? The rental of the kitchen facility, all the insurance, all of those things, the POS system or the Shopify site. And then we also have $5,000, which again, we're going to keep it pretty simple here and say that we're going to use that full $5,000 to buy and to produce product. Okay. So we've got our 50% margin here again, and we've laid this chart out a little bit different so we could see really the effects kind of happen across the screen. And what I'm going to do is actually hide this here so that we can see even more of it. So from that $5,000 that we produced at a 50% margin, we are generating $10,000 in revenue, right? Amazing. We need to purchase or produce more products in the future. So we're going to take $5,000 from that revenue and we're going to put it toward a new round of production, right? The other thing we're going to do is we're going to pay a portion. As you pointed out, it's rare that someone pays back the entire borrowed amount like in one sales cycle. So here we're going to
Yeah.
say, okay, we're paying back $1,000 on the credit
Okay.
card this month. Okay. Or in this month. So we've spent $5,000 from our revenue on production, right? For another round of product. We spent $1,000 on the credit card and we have $4,000 available for operating expenses. I failed to mention that in this scenario, I'm assuming that $4,000 is exactly what we need. So I'm being generous here and saying that in our first month, we have generated exactly what we need to cover our operating expenses when we're selling at a 50% margin. Not always the case, but again, I'm being generous
Okay.
here in this scenario.
Okay.
We have no money in the bank account beyond that. So we're just sort of meeting the essential needs of the business here in terms of being able to produce more product, the same amount that we produced before, paying a little bit on the credit card and covering our operating expenses. We don't have to borrow any new debt per se, right? And the amount of debt that we have went from $10,000 at the onset down to $9,000 with that payment that we just made. So we're calling it month 2 here. You can think of it as sales cycle number 2, but as we sell through that $5,000 worth of product at a 50% margin, we're generating another $10,000, right? When that product is gone, we're going to take another 5, right, to produce more product. We're going to make another $1,000 payment on the card. We've still got, right, that $4,000. We've got another 4 grand available in month 2 for operating expenses. That's amazing. There's no more money in the bank. So like, please nothing break. They don't like nothing extra can pop up, right? And we've reduced our debt down to $8,000. The takeaways from this, and you can sort of see in this scenario from months 1 through month 9, we are essentially generating enough money to produce another round of product, right? In the exact same like number of units. We can make $1,000 payment to the credit card and we can cover our bare minimum operating expenses. And that's it. And once we have paid down the debt, then the money that was going toward the debt is now the sort of surplus money in the bank. And so we're seeing in month 11 that we've got $1,000 in the bank. This is essentially our cash runway now. Month 1 through 10, we had no cash runway. We had just enough cash to get us through that period of time. That's it, right? Maybe it was considered a 4-week cash runway because it was a month worth of expenses. But now we've got more cash. We can do things with this. We can increase our production, right? Maybe we want to go up to $6,000 worth of production costs instead of sticking at 5, right? Maybe we need to invest in another employee or more equipment, or you want to pay yourself. The bottom line is that we've got a little bit of money that we now have something to do with. And if we hang on to it, it grows over time in the bank account. If we spend it, right, then the bank account goes back to zero and we generate another $1,000 each month. So essentially in this scenario, we're generating $1,000 sort of extra each month that we have something that we can do with it, basically.
I know in a recent episode, you suggested having a 12-week runway, right? Or a 3-month
Yeah.
cash flow runway. Uh, Can we look here and see like at what point will we have that in this scenario?
Yeah. So what we're thinking about here is then since our operating expenses are $4,000, right? We would have a 12-week operating expense cash runway in month 22, but that's if we don't increase our operating expenses and if we don't increase our production, right? Because that would reduce this
Mhm.
number. So then in month 23 is when we would have 12 weeks of cash, operating expense cash in the bank and then some. So you could take, let's say, $1,000 from month 23 and put it toward increasing production. You would maintain that runway, right? And you could also grow your production a bit and thus grow your revenue and kind of change the financial cycle at that point.
Yeah. So it is possible, to get there in this scenario, but it's taking a lot of time to get there, a lot of time before we're able to look at growth without taking on new debt in our
Mhm.
business. And this is with, again, really simplified numbers, right?
Right. And saying like we're not spending anything other than exactly this amount.
Yeah, no emergencies are happening. No, nothing's
Yeah.
breaking down on us. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm a little nervous to ask, but I'd love to take a look at how does this play out if you are under a 50% margin?
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I've marked month 11 as like the month where we are out of debt and like essentially we've got some extra cash in the bank, and then I'm going to mark um month 23. I'm going to mark it in green as like the point where we have 12 weeks of operating cash in the bank. Okay. So then if we change this to 40%, there's a lot of changes on the spreadsheet for
Mm,
folks that aren't
mhm.
looking at it. And even those of you who are, it's a lot to take in. So let's kind of walk through it here. So that $5,000 that we took to make product at a 40% margin is going to generate $8,333 in revenue. So if we tuck aside that $5,000 to make our next round of product, and we stick with that $1,000 of credit card payments, what we see here is that we actually don't have the full $4,000 to operate, right, for those operating expenses. And what the sheet is showing us is that we're short about $1,667. And so this
Mhm.
would be a situation where we would have to borrow more money. So we're either using a credit card to pay for those operating expenses, or we're taking like more cash from the line of credit or something like that. We need money from the business. Now, if the business had money in its checking account or like a savings account, it would be that you maybe took it from there, right? So the cash on hand would be reducing as opposed to your debt growing. But that's a reduction in cash, which is important to also point out, right? If that's your reality. In this scenario, because we're dealing strictly with debt and not a lot of savings, and not any savings here, we're showing that our debt has gone from $10,000 to $10,667, right? So we made a bit of a payment, but we also borrowed more than what we just paid on it.
Yeah.
So from that $5,000 that we had tucked away in month 1 for our next production run, at that 40% margin, we're generating $8,333. We're tucking away another 5 for the next production run. This is something that has to happen, right? We're also
Mhm.
putting $1,000 toward our debt, right? Or credit card in this example. We again fell short $1,667 for our operating expenses. So once again, we're needing to borrow that amount of money. So the debt is going up again. So we were at 10,667. Now we're at 11,333.
Sarah, one of the patterns I'm noticing here, right, as we play this out month after month or cycle after cycle, is that we're continuing to not have enough revenue to cover the production, the debt repayment, and our operating expenses.
Yeah.
And so I think my initial thought would be, okay, so then I need to grow my revenue, right?
Mhm.
To cover those things. But as I'm looking at this spreadsheet, and I'm sure anybody that's looking at it on YouTube, uh, it just at this level of production, right? I'm seeing a growth of our debt every month.
Yeah.
And so if I'm seeing my debt growing every month, I'm imagining it's really scary, the idea of taking on more debt to grow my revenue. Like, how
Yeah.
does that work out for anyone?
Well, we'll run through the scenario, but I also want to echo what you're saying is exactly what that founder said in that email that sparked
Yeah.
this conversation around margin and cash flow in the beginning, right? Or back when we released the Rethinking Cash Flow episode. Notice that in month 11 we became debt free and cash flow positive in our business, in the sense that we had extra money in our bank account. In this scenario, at the 40% margin, it's quite the opposite. We've increased the amount of debt that we're carrying by $7,000. And it just grows and grows and grows and grows, right? Where we were at month 23, having 12 weeks of operating expenses in the bank, we're at $25,000 in debt. So very stark differences just on the outcomes for continuing to produce the same amount of product. But you're absolutely right that in this scenario, and this is what many people feel, is that I have to increase my volume of production so I can generate more revenue so that there's more money in my business. So I'm just randomly choosing to double the production here. This will take additional debt to do this, as you pointed out, which can be scary for people, but it's also very common, right? So $10,000 in production, so it's a $5,000 cost increase, is going to take our debt in this particular month 11 from 17,333 up to 22,333. Now, what's going to happen is that in the following month or sales cycle, our revenue has jumped from 8,333 to 16,667. So you have achieved greater money, right? Greater dollars flowing into your business. The
Mm-hmm.
thing is, to maintain this, we now have to produce 10,000 units or $10,000 worth of product, right? Each sales cycle. So I'm going to draw this out here. So we have the 16,000 that we generated in revenue. We need to tuck away 10 grand for our next production run. We're stating that we're still paying $1,000 on the debt. Maybe it has gone up at this point, maybe it has not. We are able to cover that $4,000 in operating expenses. And we actually, for the first time, do have a surplus in cash of $1,667. I think that's what that says. The numbers are starting to look tiny on me here. And our debt, because we did make a payment, on the debt, has reduced slightly to $21,333. And what we see here, because the volume has resulted in enough cash flowing in the business to essentially cover the operating expenses, there is a growing bank balance month over month. And we also see the debt reducing in this scenario by $1,000 each month, right? So if we, just to kind of mirror what we looked at the 50% margin scenario, if we roll this out, we do have $13,000 in the bank, which is 12 weeks, a little more than 12 weeks worth of operating expenses, not operating and cost of goods, but enough for the operating expenses in
Mm-hmm.
month 19. But we're also still carrying $14,000 in debt. So you can have that cash runway goal, but you'll also still be carrying the debt, which is fine so long as you're comfortable with that. And as we kind of keep scrolling, we, after 26 months, are still carrying some debt, but our bank balance is growing as well. And what the bank balance means is that you have the ability to pay down some of the debt, or you have the ability to expand your team, save for taxes if you're showing profitability on the P&L, sort of all of the things that you need to do in the business. The important takeaway here is that if you are going to rely on volume, know that you're going to have to take an initial investment or an additional investment, right, to grow that production. If you're not in a scenario which is relatively comfortable, like this one, and you've got $4,000 in operating expenses, right, you might need to generate more revenue. So the need to knows here are, what are my operating expenses and how much revenue do I need to generate in order to cover those expenses? And how does my margin affect my ability to do that? Because remember, at 50% margin, we were able to do that in 11 months. At a
Mm-hmm.
40% margin, we had to take on more debt, go into significant, in this scenario, more than double the amount of debt than what we started at, to be able to reach the volume to then be able to get the cash. And likely that you're going to want to increase production again, right? In which case more debt would be needed to do that up until a certain, point in time. One of the things that we have seen, and where this can be a problematic scenario for people, is when the amount of debt they've had to take on becomes a lot to service. And by service, we mean payback, right? The minimum monthly
Mm-hmm.
payment. So if you've taken on a lot of debt to start your business, and there's the need to take on more debt to grow the business, in order to get the cash you need in there, you can get into a vicious cycle of more debt for more growth. But then I need even more growth because I need more cash to service my debt. And we've seen businesses close because they found themselves in that situation. And when you get too far into it, there's kind of no way out. The selling
Yeah.
more won't get you out. So again, it's about awareness, it's about understanding what is my situation, what do my margins mean for me, and how comfortable am I with this?
Yeah, and going back to, the idea that I, like me personally, am someone who's not super comfortable with taking on a lot of debt. Another thing that you've already kind of mentioned but really stands out to me about this scenario is that we're assuming in this scenario that everything is going perfectly.
Mhm.
Right? Nothing is breaking down. All my units are selling every month. My operating expenses are relatively low. Like, all this is like the perfect scenario.
Yeah.
And we still see this ballooning of the debt after, when we try to increase the production. So
Yeah.
now that we've looked at that, I would really like to swing the pendulum the other way
Yeah.
and see, what does it look like if we're above 50% margin?
Yeah. So we'll go to 60 because it's just what we did, in the previous scenario. So the $5,000 from the initial production run at a 60% margin results in $12,500 in revenue. If we take away, we tuck away that 5,000 for our next production run, we pay $1,000 on the credit card. We not only have the $4,000 to cover our operating expenses, but we immediately have a surplus of $2,500. And so in this scenario, we reach that $12,500 or that 3 months of operating cash at month 5.
Yeah, and then I see you're still paying down the debt in that first 10 months, right?
Mhm.
Which, if somebody felt like they wanted to pay it down faster and maybe sacrifice their cash runway to get rid of the debt and then build I mean, it just seems like you have a lot more options.
Yeah. Yeah, and we didn't change month 11, doubling our production. So we can see that we are able to double production here without borrowing money, without having to take on more debt. Now, you might have to do it initially, or you might decide to do it, right? Like I might argue that you don't want to take all of your cash and dump it into growth, right? You might want a low interest option, right? Or form of debt to take out, to borrow from for that production and then be able to pay it back quickly when you generate the revenue, right? Because particularly in CPG, it can be a long time from when you actually spend money on product to when you get paid for it, right? They're net 30 terms. There's even longer terms if you're working with a distributor, et cetera. So, you know, you can, but you're in such a flexible and really comfortable position at this point because you're not adding to your debt. You're like just taking on a bit of debt, right? You're starting
Yeah.
again. And I actually like low cost debt as funding options because I like businesses to have cash, right? And that's part of the reason why I always say like debt is not a bad thing. It's just about knowing how much do you feel comfortable taking on? How much are you going to need to take on? And
Mhm.
and really, today's episode is all about driving home the concept of how your margin affects your cash flow and what it could mean for your business if you're operating at 60% versus 50 or 50 versus 40, and if there's someone watching today who's like, wait a second, like 60 seems crazy, 55 feels more, reasonable. Okay. 55 still gets the job done. I am
Oh, wow,
still,
yeah.
right? Like I'm still in a good place. In month 10, my debt is paid off. In month 11, I'm still able to invest an additional $5,000 into the production of the cost of goods sold. So it doesn't have to be some crazy amount. And if you're listening and you're wondering, how do I get to these margins? How do I do this? There are, episodes where we talked about the margin versus pricing conundrum, right? If you're someone who's like, my price is at my price ceiling, I can't possibly go any higher. Think about product mix, think about channel mix, get
Mm-hmm.
strategic about those things to improve your overall gross profit margin. Look into your ingredient and packaging and other cogs. I think the episode with Ingredient Brothers, he really presents a lot of interesting ideas. The episode with Jason from Deo Water, like he talks through a lot of things. We've got a lot of great, like, I think motivating and inspiring and informing episodes on how do you achieve margin without raising your price, because that's not the only option. Likewise, it's not about raising margin at the risk of quality, of your product either.
I think that's a really important piece to this, right? Because it kind of goes two ways. Like if you are starting out, like if you're starting your business now, having this information is so valuable in determining the price of your products,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
But I think, like you're saying, if you are someone who is already in business and you're trying to figure out how to get more margin out of the price that you're already at, like you said, those episodes that you referenced have really, really great information on how to look at that.
I'll also add that if you're wanting to do work like this, like, again, this is an oversimplified spreadsheet, right? For ease of communicating a core concept. The cash flow projector that we have on the Good Food CFO website essentially helps you to walk through this, but in greater detail and specificity for your business. So, that's something that you can tap into and work through and try to figure out, what if I was generating 10% more margin on the products that I'm selling, right? How would I see that impact on my business? I'll also add to the list of episodes to listen to. It's called Pulling Out of Retail. That episode, like, in reality, right, if we like dive deeper into it, is about right sizing and finding the channels and the business model that gets you the margin that you need to be successful. And that's essentially what we're talking about here as well. So I think that that's also a really great episode to listen to if you're someone who's like, okay, I get this concept now and I want to figure out how I get the margin that I think I need. How can I change parts of my business to achieve it? Those are great resources.
And I think the bottom line, right, is as you've already said, and we even said in this episode, like every business is unique and
Yeah.
every business will have a different target for their product margins
Mm-hmm.
and their gross profit margin,
Yep.
right? But as you can see from these examples, if you're starting out your business with a gross profit margin of under 50%, you're going to hit a wall, right? And it's going to be difficult to continue to try to grow your business, let alone just maintain it without taking on more debt, without sacrificing the cash in your business. And I think what matters the most is that every founder take the time to work through their own scenario with their own
Mm-hmm.
targets and figure out what that looks like for them,
Yeah.
right?
And be honest with yourself about how much debt you're comfortable taking on from a personal standpoint, but then also how much debt is realistically like the max that your company could handle, right? Because there is a max that a company can take on. And so it's both a feeling kind of thing and a hard numbers.
Yeah, definitely. And when we talk about those hard numbers, right? I mean, I know you've already referenced the cash flow projector. We also have the perfect pricing calculator, which can really help you dive into what does that margin look like especially through different sales channels.
Yep.
And I know I speak for you when I say like you don't have to use our tools, but you need a tool.
Yeah.
Just to get clear on all of these things and really have an understanding in how pricing, margin, and cash are impacting your business.
Yep. Yeah.
If you'd like to learn more about any of the tools or resources mentioned in this episode, Visit thegoodfoodcfo.com and click on courses.
Thank you for joining us here today. If you enjoyed this episode or found it helpful or inspiring in any way, please share it with your founder friends on social and rate and review the podcast wherever you listen. It's the #1 way to help good food founders find the show. We'll be back with a brand new episode next week.